Welcome to the Sanctuary Saga How to Play video. Sanctuary Saga is a 2 to 4 player cooperative strategy deck building card game where players take on the role of guild leaders in the city of Sanctuary and work together to overcome the various challenges of the narrative deck. Each player at the beginning of the setup decides which guild to be, so review the guild abilities of the guild hall that can be unlocked with build counters throughout the course of the game, as well as the profession cards available to that guild, and decide which would be best for your playstyle. The objective of the game is to completely clear the narrative zone as well as the narrative deck, while the city has at least 1 or more health. If ever the city health reaches 0, the players lose. For the purposes of this demonstration, I'm going to be setting up a 2-player game. So I select 2 guilds, 1 for each player, and I delete all of the cards and guild halls that do not correspond with the 2 chosen guilds. The profession cards that are remaining for the guilds that I have selected form the tavern, where the professions just kind of hang out until they are hired by the guilds to work. The citizen deck are generic guildless citizens of Sanctuary that can be hired to help out in various ways. So they are also cards that can be purchased. So go ahead and shuffle the citizen deck, reveal the top 3, and this forms the city center where the citizenry can be hired. If at any point a player hires a profession from outside of their own guild, they gain a squabble because members of their guild are upset that they sought help outside of the guild. A squabble is a dead draw, and when played on a player's turn, it is very simply returned to the squabble supply. The exception to that rule is that guards and investors are council professions and are considered a part of every guild, so players do not gain squabbles from gaining them. Player cards have their cost in the lower right-hand corner, and when they are played, what they produce as far as resources and skills are in the upper left-hand corner, and if they have abilities, that is listed in the text box. So the next part of the setup is I need to set the narrative deck, and in this introductory chapter, these are ordered, so you simply need to keep the narrative deck for the number of players in the game. Since it's a 2-player game, I will delete the 3 and 4-player narrative deck, and I will keep that in order, and that forms the narrative draw. The next thing we need to do is put 2 time counters on the introductory chapter card because the city building turn limit is 2. So for the first 2 turns of the game, it will be a little easier on the players so that they can get their decks in order. Speaking of decks, each player has a starting deck, so they need to claim one of those, and you can either leave the other 2 here or you can delete them. It's up to you. As far as what is in the starting decks, I'll go ahead and show you here. Each player starts with 6 gold, 3 specialization, and 1 footman. 1 footman, very simply, when played to a play area, produces 1 combat, which can be used to fight enemies, or if you look at the guild hall for each player, there are a number of basic actions that every player can take. They are all the same for each guild, but you must be able to spend the requisite resource or skill in order to be able to use them. So there is combats right there. Gold very simply produces 1 gold when played, and gold once again is used to purchase profession cards to add to a player's deck. The final starting card is a specialization, and each guild produces a different skill when they play a specialization. So the Academy Expedition specialization produce the skill of lore, whereas the Dwarves specialization produces labor. The different skills can be found as examples on the last page of the rulebook, where we see the iconography as well as an overview of the turn order. The 6 skills, 1 corresponding to each of the guilds: diplomacy for government, explore for Sylph-Elven, labor for Dwarf, lore for academy, subterfuge for thieves guild, and support for the celestial missionaries. The difference between resources and skills is that skills can be used to pay for generic costs, which are on narrative deck cards, as well as 4 of which can be used to buy build counter, which is what is used to power up the different unique player abilities on each of the different guild halls. They have to be unlocked. And those refer to total number of counters. So 1 unlocks the level 1 ability, 3 unlocks the level 2 ability, and a total of 6 unlocks the level 3 ability. The combat and gold, once again, cannot be used to pay for generic costs, so that is the distinction. When a player takes their turn, each player will start off with a hand of 5, and they commit cards to their play area one at a time. In this game, whenever a card is played, the entire effects of that card are resolved before they or any other player can play another card. The reason why that is pertinent is there are harmony effects, which allow players to commit cards to their play area during another player's active turn, and the active player gets an effect. The player that committed the harmony immediately replaces the card in their hand, but the card stays in the play area until the active player's turn is over, in which case it is placed in their discard pile. So the Academy player would commit these cards one at a time and add resources and skills to their pool of available resources to spend. And they would buy Professor for 3. When a card is gained, it goes to the player's discard pile. They could cycle if they chose to, one of the cards there. There's really not anything they can do with one lore at the beginning of the game. So once their turn is done, they clear their discard pile as well as their hand. They clear their play area as well as their hand to the discard pile and draw back up to 5. If at the beginning of the turn, cards or narrative effects have forced them to discard cards, they don't draw up until the end of their turn. So sometimes you can start with less than 5 cards at the beginning of your turn. In fact, oftentimes you will. So once a player is done with their turn, you move on to the next player. And once all players have gone in a clockwise order, it is the narrative phase. During the narrative phase, if there are any face-up narrative cards, the players resolve them one at a time in an order of the player's choosing. Since this is the city building phase, we take one of these time counters off, put it back in the bag, and we only flip one card at the end of the narrative phase. Generally, you would flip a number of cards equal to the number of players in the game, but during the city building phase, you only flip one card in a 2 to 3 player game, or 2 cards in a 4-player game into the narrative zone. Now, these cards can be interacted with by the players. Enemies are very straightforward, or I would say the most straightforward. Whenever they act during the narrative phase, they simply do the amount of their attack by the sword as damage to the city. So this would deal 1 damage. And very simply, to defeat it, the players need to commit 3 combat worth of damage counters to this card. The player that deals the killing blow gets to actually claim the card as a trophy, and it just hangs out in their play area until such a time that they choose on their turn to discard it to the narrative supply to produce 1 gold. So it can be used to either produce or to purchase higher, more expensive guild cards, or it can be used to pay other costs that might be in the narrative zone. So that is how enemies work. And if they have abilities, they will trigger whenever the card acts. Portents are events that will occur to Sanctuary if the players do not prevent them from happening. So they come in with a number of time counters equal to the time value. When this card acts, you remove a time counter. If it has a persist effect, you trigger the persist effect whenever a time counter is removed during the narrative phase. And when all of the time counters are removed from a portent, whatever is listed at the top of the text box is what occurs. Once all time counters are removed, the card is discarded, or if the players complete all of these micro scenes. So the cost for each of these scenes that the players would need to do in order to prevent the bad things from happening are listed here. So this says 1 explore or 2 generic skill are the cost of putting the completion counter over that leftmost scene. So once all the scenes are completed, if the players do all of that before all the time counters are removed, this card is simply removed from the narrative zone at that time. So that is how players interact with portents. Plots are a little bit different. They are an ongoing issue or concern in Sanctuary. So they are more time sensitive. They cannot be interacted with during the player's turn unless a card specifically says that it can. And anytime a plot acts during the narrative phase, you simply remove 1 time counter, and however many time counters are left is the number that you read aloud and resolve. So in this instance, I remove 1. 2 says players may discard G cards if they do not deal G damage to the city. G simply is the number of guilds in the game, so in this instance 2. The players cooperatively decide what cards to discard if they choose to discard cards. So 1 player could discard both, or each player could discard 1. And if they do not, the city very simply takes 2 damage. So that is a very straightforward one. So that is how plots work. The next card type is also pretty straightforward. They are events. Anytime an event is drawn, you resolve whatever its effects are immediately. Kinship is a beneficial one that actually puts a hat on the game so that the next time a player would buy a profession card outside of their guild, they don't gain a squabble, so it's beneficial. Once an event is resolved, it just simply goes to the discard pile. That is why you need to resolve these card flips one at a time, especially in a 4-player game, because sometimes an event can make things a little hairy. You want to make sure you get that timing window correct. The fifth and final type of narrative card is an adventure. Adventures are a little more confusing in that they don't do anything but sit here until a party is formed to go on that adventure. And forming a party is done using profession cards that players commit from their hand to form that party. So in this instance, each player committed one of their 2 skill producing professions in carpenter and herbalist. And since neither of them are support or explore, we needed a total of 4 skills worth of skills in order to form the party, which we now have. At that point, we put 2 time counters on the adventure because its time icon says for 2. When this adventure acts during the narrative phase, again, you very simply remove a time counter, and nothing happens unless the card specifically states when a time counter is removed. When all the time counters are removed, the adventure is discarded, and the players who own the profession cards get them back in their discard pile. The adventures are oftentimes a key for a lock later on. And the example of this scenario is that adventure actually is the key to the Cursed Catacombs. The Cursed Catacomb has no time counters. It is a plot so that every time this acts during the narrative zone or narrative phase, it very simply adds a zombie token to the narrative zone, which is a 2/2 enemy that has no trophy, so when defeated, it just goes away. And it will do this every turn until this is completed. As soon as Find Sacred Ankh is completed, Cursed Catacombs gets discarded, and if Find Sacred Ankh was completed before Cursed Catacombs enters the narrative phase, it is immediately discarded. So that is an example of how the different narrative cards function and how players interact with those. If you have any questions, feel free to check out the instruction manual on page 3. It does have a table of contents for you to be able to jump to the appropriate page, and you can always jump into our Discord linked below, where we have a specific channel for questions and answers, particularly regarding the introductory chapter. Thank you for your time, and we hope that you enjoy the game.